Hi again, and welcome to another episode of the Ninja and Gora. Today we've got Chris Hill, who is based in Dubai, and he's an expert in TNHE. So, hi, Chris.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, it's great to see you.
It's good to have you. All right, Chris. Our first question to you is that you've had extensive experience in transnational higher education. Could you elaborate a little bit on your research and publications in TNE?
Sure, thank you, and thank you very much for having me. I've been fortunate enough to, I suppose, a little bit atypically for most TNE researchers, is I've actually worked in a TNE university, which is not unheard of, but not that typical, perhaps. My TNE research began almost by accident. So I was a political scientist for my PhD. I taught politics at the beginning in England. And then I moved to Malaysia to work for a British university, and we didn't have a politics department, and I sort of ended up reflecting on what I was doing on a daily basis. And so my TNE research track essentially began by writing down what I did last Tuesday. Like it was literally that simple, and it never really felt like, you know, proper research, because it was just something that we were doing on a daily basis. And mostly my research originated from things we did wrong. Like it was things we were learning from, because there wasn't much of a blueprint. And so I became very interested in the movement of students, but also in the value of the degree itself. And so my early research was looking at perception of TNE and the way in which that perception impacts on the local education system. So I was looking, I suppose, at the combination or the connection between the foreign value base and the local host in terms of how the two interacted, the student experience, the quality of the degree, and what that meant for education as a broader spectre. And then it moved into looking more specifically at employability, because I was very interested in, I think, the impact and legacy of TNE. So we didn't have very many studies talking about what TNE actually does. We know how to count it, we know how to recognize it, but we don't really know or understand the value it has beyond the economics to the country. What does it do for society? What does it do for the people? And that's where my research came. And I worked for a little bit, you know, doing projects for people like British Council, and then the KHDA that we're obviously very familiar with in Dubai, looking at why students choose to go where they go, what they hope to get out of it, and what the legacy of TNE is, which I think is, my research is looking at that sort of next stage of, well, what happens next? And obviously, as the current climate that we're in, we don't know what's happening now, let alone what's going to happen. So it's an interesting time for research. And then alongside that, one of your previous guests, my good friend and colleague Vangelis Tiligidis, his main area is looking at things like mapping quality and mapping experience. And so he and I have done a little bit of research on that. So you can't look at experience without looking at quality assurance, because otherwise there's a lot of opportunity for abuse. There's a lot of opportunity for a less than transparent experience. And so it's important that we look at that. So that's my main area. Not so much what is TNE, because that's relatively understood, but you know, what the value it is to the people in it, what legacy it leaves to the country, and sort of that sort of aspect.
Yeah, it's great. You mentioned employability there. So regarding employability and quality of education, what can TNHE do? What can you do to ensure the quality of that?
Yeah, and it's an excellent question, and it's something that anybody working in education has to be dealing with these questions, and particularly in TNE or TNHE, they are effectively interchangeable. Yeah. And I think it's part of a broader question about what the value of education is, in terms of, and we often get in that debate about education shouldn't be purely for employment.
Right. Because
there should be a value in the philosophical, pedagogical learning development of an individual. But there has to be an understanding of employability and sort of skill development. And I think that's interestingly something that's really come out of the COVID-19 situation, is this reflection on skill-based learning, what is relevant, what is authentic, as opposed to what is quote unquote traditional, we've done, and it's not, maybe not so relevant. And so TNE in its early stages was purely about access. So we didn't necessarily worry so much about the next stage. It was, well, by virtue of having a foreign degree that you wouldn't have been able to get because you couldn't afford, or you couldn't travel, or visa regulations wouldn't allow the student to go to the home country. You'd already opened up access, and that was already a win.
Right.
So the concept of employability wasn't understood or thought about in as much as, well, you've got a degree from university, you wouldn't already have had one, therefore, that's a tick in the win column. But I think increasingly now, TNE in particular has to look at the sustainability of the partnership in the host country, and it has to establish value for money. And value for money is now, particularly in higher education, becoming increasingly about the link to potential employment or employability. And so TNE programs, TNE hosts, TNE delivering institutions needs to have the ability to demonstrate skill development and links. And I think increasingly it's actual links. So it's not a guarantee of employment, but it's purpose-driven education. And to be fair, we saw that from the early stages. So I used to work in Malaysia, and typically the degrees that were most successful were those that were either business linked, that were maybe tourism, engineering, that sort of fell into the category of, well, this is a traditional degree with a traditional job. So modern languages was much harder to sell unless it was modern languages plus tourism, but it would always be tourism plus modern languages. And so, increasingly the value of the other type of degree is measured by its ability to get a job, because obviously the investment is significant. And so I think rather than it being, this is only about getting a job, because that's a worrying line for a university to discuss, it should be about creating the links. And so embedding things like internships, embedding things like practical experience, embedding things like connectivity with industry, obviously depends on the nature of the degree. But a very good example, for us in the UAE is the University of South Wales, which set up the campus in Dubai South. And they looked at the strength they had in the UK. They looked at what was needed here, and they built this sort of program that looks at the supply chain for aviation.
Right.
And they partnered with the national aviation, they partnered with, and they're across the street from where the airport will be. So it's not a case of get a degree, walk across the street, get a job. But there's a very clear link between, and that I think is an area where TNE providers have the opportunity, because more and more over time, host countries, TNE is about a power distribution. And in the early stages, the sending university had most of the power, because they had the thing that the host country needed.
Yeah.
And so the host country was willing to accept not anybody, but more and more providers. Over time, the host country is, you've got sort of a closer distribution of power. And now host countries are saying, we need specifically this, or our national agenda says we want this. And they go and look for the best provider to give it. And that means you've got a greater alignment between skill-based and potential, knock-on for employment. And so I think, current and future providers can look at the landscape and say, what are we good at? What can we leverage? And what can we link with? Because equally, then you've got the risk is lower and the chance of recruitment is higher. So I think it's a better situation for all involved.
Yeah, Chris, that sort of opens up another question there, because a lot of students don't, they're sort of coming to university at 18, 19, 20. Excuse me, they don't really know exactly what they want to do. So we have to look at future employability as well. So are you interested in, I guess you are interested in the trends. Where do you see them going? Yeah,
I'm very interested in them, and I'm very worried about this, because there are a lot of known unknowns. So we know that the current job market will not exist and this is, everything I'm saying is pre-COVID, right? So now everything is even more but we knew 6 months ago that the current jobs, traditional jobs, would not exist, for the next stage of graduates. We know that graduates are going to have to develop their own jobs. And the worry is that universities are essentially saying, rightfully so, you need to, as a student, need to focus on entrepreneurship, you need to focus on innovation, you need to focus on creating your own jobs, which is all well and good, but there's going to come a point when a student says, well, what's the value of a university degree?
Yeah.
If a traditional view is, I get this job, this equals this skills, this equals this job, and that line doesn't exist anymore, maybe the money I'm paying for a university degree is better spent going through an incubation and setting up my own company.
Yeah.
And so if a university's put the emphasis on the student to say, well, we're here because we're experts in a thing that we don't understand, that nobody understands, that we don't know that exists. And so I think what will happen is we'll start to see trends of skill development. We'll start to see trends which we already, we are seeing, but possibly moving into the sort of more micro degree approach, the sort of cross-disciplinary, more problem-based, where you're building towards a solution attempt rather than you are building towards a collection of facts. And I think that actually that's one of the issues that COVID-19 has really highlighted, that this access to information, this transparency, mobility of ideas for problem solving is probably more relevant than a traditional degree, which, you look at countries like India, for example, Pakistan, with the numbers of engineers that they graduate every single year, who the minute they graduate are unemployed because the market simply, but it doesn't stop people constantly going in. And I wonder perhaps that we might have this sort of lost generation. The current university population, their children are less likely to go to university because the experience of their parents will be, it was a drain on money. It didn't. So, and then you'll start to see a shift in the sector. So we have an opportunity to reassess and reflect. If we don't adapt, then that will be, I think, a problem. I was reading an interesting article. So one of your previous guests, Fabrizio, I was reading something that he'd posted a little while ago about NARIC now looking at the accreditation and the development of vocational. And I think that's an area where TNE, for example, has a real potential to grow. So looking at what is relevant, what is needed, because the only thing essentially separating, universities and vocational is the perception. It's the elitism, or it's the snobbery of, well, this is one route of this is another route. But the route of vocational problem-solving development is what the world needs more than it needs another person that, has a higher degree that doesn't necessarily take them where they need to go. So I think there's a nice opportunity for real development in this area.
Yeah.
Well, you're absolutely right about that, and it's kind of worrying. But I'll bring you back a little bit to academics and the university setup. So you talked about quality management. Chris, what about the student experience in quality, and how do we ensure quality management in the TNHE context? So we are giving these students the same degree, the same certificate, but is the experience comparable? Is it equivalent that you worked in several countries, so how is it?
Yeah, no, I have. I worked for a university that had campuses in 3 countries, and I graduated from one of them and worked in another one, and then sort of worked a little bit in the third. I was based in Southeast Asia before I came to the Middle East, and a very common expression in many Southeast Asian countries is same but different. And it's very, very relevant for TNE, and I think it's the word that you pointed out is absolutely the right one, which is comparable. Because it will not be the same. And it shouldn't be the same, because there is value in moving and there's value in learning from others. And I think one of the issues about TNE is that attempt to replicate exactly without a view of understanding the context and building in that local knowledge. Because if TNE is done properly, a host country from Australia or from the UK sends a campus to Malaysia or China or Dubai, then there should be reciprocal understanding. That campus should learn from that context and feed that back into the curriculum to globalize the learning experience, rather than it just being, one direction of information flow. And so I think it's very, very important that opportunities are equivalent. And again, this changes from country to country. But for example, when I worked on a British university in Malaysia, the campus in Malaysia was still subject to British law. So things like disability, access, equality, and that can cause obviously some friction between what is the national law and what is the national law of the home country. But in terms of equal opportunity, equal access, student records, student materials, these all have to be consistent. They have to be transparent, and by and large, TNE operations are very heavily audited and very heavily quality assured. And by and large, they're done in more places than normally. So they'll be done at home, but they'll also be done. So for example, if it's a British one, they'll be done part of the QAA, wherever they are. But then they'll also be audited by quality assured by the host country where they find. And so you've got this sort of doubling down to ensure that there is equivalency. Certainly over the last 5 to 10 years, the internal management of TNE operations has become increasingly more transparent, increasingly better understood, increasingly better. So there is greater communication, there is greater understanding, there is greater similarity and equivalency in the material. But it does still need to be done with an awareness of context, I think, because that's very, very important for the student experience. And we had this issue in Malaysia at the beginning, where the perception of TNE sort of 20 years ago, well, for example, 20 years ago, nobody really understood what it was. But when they started to understand or be aware of it, it was, well, it can't be as good as the home country, right? And often it was because the cost was lower, because the cost of living in many TNE host countries is less than it would be in the home country. And so you think, well, if the degree costs $100 in England, but it only costs $40 here, it can only be 40% of the quality. And it's a perception, you know, which is in some cases potentially there's some truth to it, and in other cases obviously not. And so you have to get to this point where it's like, no, it's one degree. It doesn't matter where you do it in the university structure, it's one degree assured by quality processes. That requires paperwork, policies, processes, training, transparency, and constant reflection. And that's a good thing. I mean, we notice, obviously, when we work in the UAE, the amount of information that is made public by institutions is less than it would be in other countries. For example, you know, in terms of the annual reporting, the student numbers, the graduating numbers. Yeah. Different countries have different systems of how and whom they report it to, but that information has to be made public or made available to, you know, as needed. And I don't think this is a bad thing. This is something I've been talking about and I'm not remotely unique in this, but for a while, about this sort of overarching quality assurance of TNE. Because if it's done poorly, it damages everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How much is being done for teacher development in the TNE context? So we've got all universities don't have a fly in, fly out faculty. They hire locally, but what do they do to ensure that the standards are the same?
So it's an excellent question, but obviously it's a very, very big question. There are many, many different stages of what people do. Certainly it's getting better, right? The financial model, you know, 15, 20 years ago was you'd have, for a campus even that was fully fledged, you'd have a couple of senior people who'd be there permanently, you know, on a 2 or 3 year basis, but would be permanent staff. And then you'd have local staff hired, because obviously the salary structure being what it was. And there's a very strong logic for that, which is you want to build local capacity, you want local context, you want to grow the understanding. The counter side to that was the only way you can really ensure quality of the degree is if the exact material that's taught in the home country is taught in the host country. Yeah. And taught in the same manner. Yeah. And there's a certain logic to that, certainly maybe in the initial stage, but over time that has to be developed. And so, for example, I mean, if you're a British university and all academic staff are required to do the PGCHE, you know, they're required to have training built into their program, that is rolled out on the foreign or branch or international TNE campuses, however you want to call them. And so professional development is becoming more and more the norm. But it's still an area where there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And that's sort of an ongoing thing. One of the issues I found at the beginning of my career in TNE was this sort of, I suppose, a very British post-colonial, but still harking back to colonial understanding of, well, if somebody can teach or do this on the home campus, they can automatically do it on another country's campus. And certainly at the beginning, there was almost no training available in terms of cultural awareness or communication, or, you know, very, very little done, because the assumption was, well, we are replicating the home campus and the quality is based on the home campus. So if you can understand the home campus, therein lies the quality of the degree. And that's not wrong, but flawed. And so certainly over time, you know, you'd start to see staff mobility moving back and forth. So people not just flying for a week, but actually, you know, people in key administrative posts moving and exchanging that sort of knowledge and communication. Because the more you understand, the better you can relate to the problems, and the greater the communication, you know, the greater the opportunity for success. So staff training is certainly becoming more and more relevant. I have a colleague of mine in Dubai who joined University of Birmingham, the Birmingham campus in Dubai, and she joined a couple of years ago. And she was sent to the UK for at least 2 weeks of staff training in Birmingham to then come back. Because there's the flip side, which is if you don't understand the home country, it's difficult to be able to underpin the quality, but there needs to be the link to the context.
Yeah.
Australian universities do this and have been doing this very well for a long time, and there's obviously a significant cost to this, right? Because you're flying people from one country to another, putting them through training, but the benefit is significant, right? It's a more ethical, and I think it's a more sound approach to try to build those links. Not so much relevant as you say with the fly-in, because they are specifically flying in, but increasingly you get fly-in where you're getting this rotation of professors from different places, and then you've got no real sense of who you were. And one of the big things in my research at the early stages of my career, I suppose, was this understanding of, from a student's perspective, of to which university they belong.
Yeah.
Or are you attending a British university? Are you attending a British university in Malaysia? Are you attending a Chinese university? Like what and that's something that ties back to your question about student experience. Like it ties back to identity, it ties back to opportunity, it ties back to TNE campuses at the very beginning when they first set up are very closely to high schools. Like they're about teaching, they're about student numbers, research, identity, student experience. That it evolves over time. Like it's the newer ones learn from the older ones and hit the ground running, a lot faster, which is great. There's the evolution of the system. So
it's been a huge, massive progress in the past 20 years, 20 to 30. Is that right for TNE?
Yeah.
So you spoke about student experience, professional development. One question that I always like to ask is about assessment. So quality management in assessment and its processes, comparability, equivalency, moderation. How is all of that ensured in TNE? Again, a big question, varied across universities and campuses, but in your experience and research, could you shed a little light on it?
Sure, and obviously a critical issue, but actually one which is easier to understand and regulate than the student experience because it's process-based. You replicate the system, right? You have the same marking criteria, you have the same standards, you have the same first marking, second marking, external marking. It goes through the same boards. That system, because that is the thing on which the survival or existence of the campus rests. The student experience isn't. If you look at it from a pure sort of bottom line, if you're not doing the same quality and you're not assuring the degrees, the qualification agencies are going to have a problem. If your students aren't happy, that can be seen or could be seen as a secondary issue. Now, of course, under current climates of the last however many years, student satisfaction surveys are a clear marker of the success of a campus, which is obviously a good progress. But in terms of quality assessment and assurance, they are much cleaner to understand. And so they are transparent. You do this box, you do this box. And quite often when a TNE host campus is audited or quality assessed, they will look at it and say, what's your home campus process? Do you do that here? Good. It will literally be, how do you map onto the existing? And that has therefore been something that's been relatively strong throughout because it's very closely regulated by lots of people.
But in your experience, would you say that these policies and these processes exist on paper, but when it comes to each coordinator, each faculty member, are they actually implemented?
So again, I mean, I can't answer for, but every TNE experience I've been involved with, yes, they are followed.
All right.
Because they are critical, right? They are. If you get that wrong, it's not just maybe the students didn't get to play football this year. No, their degree doesn't count. Like it has a much more significant impact. I mean, I was involved in multiple audits, and I now actually am on the other side of it. So I'm an external examiner. I audit and assess degrees internationally. And I mean, it's a paperwork-driven thing that is there for a very real purpose. There's always going to be an element of box ticking, right? Because it's a bureaucratic process.
Yes.
But it's very evidence-based. And in the quality assurance, they'll always bring in student stakeholders. They'll always have, you need evidence of actual people who've done this. And so it's a base of quantitative and qualitative. And in that respect, I think it's a good process. Yeah.
Obviously, the biggest change recently has been the COVID thing. So we've had to very rapidly adapt to the use of technology. So how do you think post-COVID this is going to affect traditional learning spaces?
So yeah, like you, I mean, I taught this last term fully online. I suppose I was slightly luckier maybe than some of my colleagues in that I teach on ICT modules. And so there was a few of us in my faculty we'd been teaching online or blended for a little while. And so, you know, we were maybe slightly more comfortable in the space. But obviously the tricky thing about, that's a massive understatement, the tricky thing about COVID was the fact that people weren't working from home. They were living from home with their children who were also being schooled. And so it was such a strange situation that the pressures and stresses were, you know, significant. But I think, and my colleague, Dr. TNHE Charles, and I have done a little bit of research on this, looking at sort of the impact of, and we've seen a few trends and a few ideas. And I think some of the positives that will come out of this, in terms of the use of technology and what it'll do for the learning spaces. One very interesting one is the discussion about well-being. So not just student, but staff well-being, you know, and how people cope with technology, and this understanding that just because you can use a laptop or a phone doesn't mean you understand how to use it to teach.
Yeah.
And just because a student knows how to surf and use Instagram doesn't mean they know how to learn through technology. Yeah. And so there's a space in between the integration of technology and actual the pedagogical valued use of technology, and that's caused a lot of stress and a lot of anguish for a lot of people. But it's also firmly raised the reality that schools and institutions need ICT policies, which include training. And I think post-COVID, part of the learning space for schools will not be how great is your swimming pool or how great is your theatre. It will be, what is your online digital learning platform? What is the access, usability, and functionality of it? And how well are your teachers trained to teach through an online platform? And so that, I think, has been very, very useful. It's not that we didn't know this, but it was effectively ignored. And I think one of the strange realities about technology and teaching is 2 weeks before COVID really kicked in terms of closing down schools. And so whichever country those have been in, technology and teaching was, you know, it was on the margins. It was, for many, many countries, it's not real. Like, it's not the same, you know, it's not accredited, you know, it's might be a useful tool, but it's not. And then, 24 hours after COVID, no, it's exactly the same. There's no disruption. Your education experience is identical. Well, that's impossible. Because the people have not had training or exposure in this. Plus, they're in a heightened sense of stress because people are panicking about everything, rightfully so. And so it's raised this idea that actually, no, there's a space and a value for online learning, which doesn't have to be fully online. And so one of the things that I think, hopefully post-COVID, is we wouldn't simply go back to the old normal. Because that would be a loss of the reflection we've been able to go through, thinking about how do we teach? How do we encourage engagement? How do we use technology to develop skills? You know, so it's purpose-driven. And then particularly coming back to your question about assessment, how do we make sure that assessment is authentic? How do we make sure that assessment is relevant and is actually done? And you asked a question in one of your previous sessions. We were talking about plagiarism in TNHE. And the plagiarism through technology, you know, is a massive problem, which most universities and schools maybe less so, but certainly universities are facing. Just turn the camera on. But in some cultures, people wouldn't want the camera on, or they don't have the capability for the camera on. Or actually, even though you've got the camera on, I've got somebody in the room next door to me who's using a proxy to my computer to ask questions anyway. So, you know, I think it's raised several issues that we just don't know how to deal with yet because it's very, very new. But it's raised a lot about the internal capability of the schooling system, education system, the need for training for teachers. And I think it's also brought to the fore the role of parents. You know, the parental engagement in teaching, I think, is particularly school level, has been, you know, very, very important. The past, I'm losing track, 4 months, 2.5 years. I'm not sure how long we've been in this, but a long time.
Yeah, 4 months. All right.
Yeah. Now, again, due to COVID, restrictions on travel. So how do you see the higher education landscape, the geographical landscape changing?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question, and it's one that actually belies the reality of TNE, because the percentage of students globally that move of the total number of students is very, very small.
Right.
Right? So, it's not that we've got 40% of the world's students moving on a regular basis. Like it's a very low number proportionally to the whole structure, and so we will still get movement. I was reading an interesting article that was talking, I think in Times Higher, that was talking about the redistribution of geographical. And so, for example, particularly the UK and the US will lose a massive amount of their market share. It's going to cause a massive downturn. And so I think particularly the article was talking about the movement maybe to New Zealand and Australia, where they've coped with, I mean, this was before Australia's second spike, but they've coped with different things. And so I think you'll start to see a movement. I think what will be very interesting, and this has been coming for a long time now, is China. Because the problem with TNE is the sort of relative over-reliance on several key markets, China and India being the main ones. And if you lose that market share, that's a massive problem for your TNE sector. And the thing with China is the more it becomes fully capable of delivering its own TNE provision domestically, the less need there is to export students. And if you lose the China export market, there will be several countries that will take a massive, massive hit. I don't think that's going to be overnight, but I think we will see a redistribution of the numbers. And I think so. I don't think TNE in a whole it's not going to collapse. In many cases, you saw this sort of run towards new TNE programs within the first week of COVID. Oh, well, people can't come, we'll go to them. Yeah. And that's not that far away from the thinking of 10, 15 years ago, which is, oh, let's go to the market. Yeah, I mean, there's an element of that within TNE development, which makes sense. But I think new players, new emergence, and it still needs to be reasoned based on all the things we've been talking about, because it's not if you're going into TNE to make money, that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
A full-fledged branch campus maybe turns a profit after a decade. There has to be other ways and other motivations for what you're doing. And so I think that's going to be relevant. But you've seen the recent example of Cornell University doing the Study Away program that they've come up with, which is a very interesting way of partnering with multiple universities around the world and to do co-sharing of teaching. So using the facilities, but sort of co-sharing with some of the modules from Cornell and some of the modules from there. So sort of building this, it was in the Pi News a week ago, perhaps 10 days ago. Very interesting. So, and I think we'll start to see innovative evolution in the space. So I don't think you won't see a massive successful flocking of new providers. You'll start to see existing providers looking at new and innovative ways where you can share learning, which again is an evolution of existing TNE. You can do digital, you can do online teaching. The EMBAs have been doing this for a long time. You move people as and when for block teaching, but otherwise you keep them in particular areas and you sort of link up, and that has sort of the advantage of cross learning. So I think we'll start to see some new opportunities, but in terms of the actual geographics, I mean, the actual numbers are actually relatively healthy if you look at sort of TNE recruitment for the coming year. It's funny, I was watching the video you did with Vangelis, and when you asked him, well, what's the future, and he said, I don't know. But yeah, that's exactly my answer. I don't know. He has the benefit of the economists' massive experience and intelligence saying, I don't have the parameters. I don't even have the luxury of that. I'm like, I don't know. But I think in a similar way that when you saw in a lot of the Western areas, particularly in the UK, when student fees were significantly raised, it wasn't that the university sector collapsed, right? It was that you saw joint partnerships, the top universities still retain students. I think what's going to cause more of an issue is the value of a degree for post-study.
Yeah.
And if TNE universities can respond to that, then I think there's actually an opportunity for TNE to grow. And I think what you'll start to see is more partnership agreements because the risk is lower and the mobility is less.
Yes.
And you can literally pair academics from, so not necessarily fully joint or dual degrees, but certainly some form of shared. I don't know if we'll go the full way to sort of the micro degree module, which I mentioned before. But for example, in Academic City in Dubai, where you've got an edu hub, where you've got multiple universities, all realistically sharing not quite one building, but almost sharing a campus. I think, well, could we not have an Academic City degree, right, where each university has a suite of programs that they offer, and they're all equally accredited. They all fall under the KSDA. They're all regulated, and therefore you pick and choose, and that gets you a degree in liberal arts or problem solving or whatever the title may be. And so you build up this shared sort of collective knowledge, which is effectively a pure TNE based anyway, because nobody's from anywhere in essence, right? You're all from. I mean, it's an idea which probably will never work because it's too much bureaucracy and too much sharing of
Sounds great.
Great theory.
Okay, Chris. Now, given your expertise in all of this and your eye on all of this, any advice for both students who are planning to enroll in September or January in the coming trimesters, and also for those who are already working in the TNE context?
I've obviously been thinking about this question for a couple of days now, and because there's a lot of choice, right? What that tends to mean is that a lot of university providers around the world use the same buzzwords, right? So every university is a globally integrated digital platform, employability focused, student, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically they just cancel each other out. And so I think what's important is that prospective students need to look at as best as they can determine the output of the institution they're interested in. So looking at the types of degrees, looking at the types of teaching, looking at the types of experiences, and where possible, looking at student perception and student perspective and student narrative. Because there is no guarantee for employment ever. And I mean, even more so now, but I think in terms of advice for students applying, I think there is still, a very strong rationale for applying. But I think you've actually got more opportunity to look at what people are prepared to offer and they are offering that doesn't include the mobility. And so that will force institutions to maybe not necessarily strengthen, but make more transparent the strength of their offer within the institution, because they are now competing for student numbers. And so I think looking at, don't just take a degree for the sake of taking a degree. And I say this with full, appreciation and knowledge of the fact that choice is not always as easy for everybody in the system, right? And so, but equally the cost of versus the choice, there needs to be sort of that sort of balanced view. Those of us that are working I think it's our responsibility to communicate. I think it's not a time for isolation. It's paradoxically, it's absolutely a time for social isolation, but it's not a time for collegial isolation. I think this is an opportunity for further integration. We've seen, the plethora of webinars and free material being offered over the last couple of months. There's a willingness to reach out beyond what we can't do physically. And I think therefore there's that opportunity for increased learning and increased understanding. And I think therefore we in TNE have that opportunity to, I can't fly my students from this campus to this campus. Well, what can we do? How can we build that sort of digital network with a view to understanding? And that same is at schools as well as universities. You can work on international projects. There's this within TNE. There's this massive debate about internationalization at home, right? Which is for the 99% of students who do not get to travel. How do we build their experience to be more international? How do we build it to be more globally focused? How do we build it to be more relevant to the global skills market? And I think there's an opportunity there to do things that we should all have already been doing, but we were already doing the other things that we were doing, and so sometimes gets in the way. So for teachers, I would continue, as am I, and as are my colleagues, continue to work on professional development. Where there are areas that we're less developed in, we need to try and build those capacities and capabilities. We need to engage with networks. You asked Vangelis this question about the future of conferences. Will there be physical conferences? I think, yes, there will, but I think there will be, as he said, more and more opportunities for more and more events that are online. And you shouldn't take away from the value of going face to face, because there's tremendous importance in that. But, the cost of being able to run a 2-hour symposium online rather than having to run a full day conference, that really increases. And, there's a lot of opportunity for that. It's a little bit dangerous sometimes. I almost signed up for a cryptozoology online course to learn about Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, which I may still do just for pure weirdo interest. But I think there's an opportunity for us to learn and for us to develop. And as I said, it would be a shame if we went back to the old normal, because I think this has been a period of crisis, but it's also been a period of reflection and learning. And even personally, you realize, well, what's important, what isn't. We better understand the people in society that should be more valued than have been valued, historically. And that's the same thing with teaching and learning. There are things that you can't replicate online, but there are things that you can do very, very well online, which add massive value. And so those of us that are in TNE, we need to talk to each other. We need to be open and transparent. And students need to ask questions, not just accept and join for the sake of it, but, understand that it's a dialogue. And we have that opportunity to try and build it moving forwards.
Yeah. Chris, thank you very much for your time and your insight. It's again, we're learning all the time, and it really is. It's very valuable hearing your ideas and having your input. It's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.